Following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained. The Curse of the Red Burmese. In July 2011, 3 military helicopters crashed within a span of just 9 days in the dense jungle of Keng Krachan National Park, Thailand. The first, a Huey helicopter, went down while on a reconnaissance mission near the Thai-Myanmar border, killing all 5 on board. Days later, a Black Hawk was sent to recover the bodies only to suffer the same fate. Then, a third helicopter, about 212, dispatched for a rescue operation, also crashed under eerily similar circumstances. The official reports cited bad weather and mechanical failure. But among the locals and veteran rangers, there was another explanation, a dark tale of vengeance, curses, and restless spirits. They called it the Curse of the Red Burmese. In 2024, a documentary crew set out to uncover the truth behind these mysterious crashes. Led by Sakai, a seasoned journalist, the team consisted of MEI, a historian specializing in Southeast Asian folklore, Niran, a former military pilot, and Tun, a skeptical cameraman who dismissed supernatural stories as mere myths. Their mission was simple: travel to Keng Krachan, interview the locals and surviving rangers, and retrace the doomed flight paths to separate fact from fiction. But as they ventured deeper into the jungle, they would soon realize that some stories are meant to remain untold. One night, while gathered around a dimly lit fire in a ranger outpost, an old forest ranger named Uncle Prazert shared the tale that had haunted the region for generations. Many years ago, when this land was still a battlefield between Thai forces and Burmese invaders, he began, his voice gravelly with age. A ruthless Burmese general led his army through this very jungle. He was known as Payadang, the Red Burmese. They say he was a monster in human form, Prazert continued, staring into the fire. He slaughtered entire villages, burned their homes, and left nothing but ashes. But one day, his cruelty met its match. The local shamans, unable to fight his army with weapons, turned to darker means. They placed a powerful curse upon him, a curse that bound his spirit to this land forever. What happened to him? Emmy asked, gripping her notepad. Prazert sighed. They say his men abandoned him in fear. Alone and wounded, he tried to escape, but the jungle swallowed him whole. No one ever found his body, but the curse remained. And anyone who dares to enter this land with ill intentions will never leave. A heavy silence fell over the group. Even Tun, the skeptic, shifted uncomfortably. As the night deepened, a strange unease settled over the camp. The jungle, once alive with the sounds of insects and night birds, had grown eerily silent. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispering. Faint, distant, but unmistakable soft voices carried by the wind. The language was unfamiliar, the tone urgent yet mournful. Sakai froze. Did you hear that? Emiya nodded slowly. It's like chanting. Tun scoffed, though his hands trembled slightly. Probably just the wind, but Niran, the former pilot, paled. I've heard that before. Everyone turned to him. What do you mean? Sakai asked. Niran swallowed hard. I was stationed here in 2011. I knew some of the pilots who crashed. Before the first helicopter went down, they reported hearing strange voices over the radio, like someone was whispering to them in Burmese. A gust of wind howled through the trees, sending shivers down their spines. And then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, came the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, as if something or someone was circling the camp. The jungle had many predators, but none walked with such purpose. Who's there? Tun called out, raising his flashlight. The beam cut through the trees, revealing nothing but dense foliage. But just as he lowered the light, a figure flickered at the edge of his vision, tall, shadowed, and motionless. When he turned back, it was gone. The fire crackled, casting long, distorted shadows around them. Uncle Prazert's voice broke the silence. You should leave while you still can. But it was too late. The jungle had already decided their fate. The deeper they ventured into the jungle, the heavier the air became. Captain Thanakern led the way, his grip tightening on the map that was already damp with sweat. Following behind were Sergeant Prazert and Lieutenant Witcheye, their boots sinking into the wet earth with each cautious step. Their mission was clear: investigate the crash site of the second helicopter. The first had gone down only a week before, and the second had followed, inexplicably, just days later. Some called it coincidence, but others whispered of the Phi Phama Deng, the vengeful Burmese spirits said to haunt this land since the ancient wars. As they pressed on, a thick mist curled around them, obscuring their vision. "Stay close," Thanakern ordered. The jungle was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. Then came the whispers. At first, it was subtle, a faint murmur carried by the wind. But as they moved forward, the sound grew clearer. It was a voice, distant yet distinct. "Help me." Prazert stopped in his tracks, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" Witcheye nodded, his fingers twitching near his holster. It sounded like someone calling out, but from where? He turned in slow circles, scanning the misty undergrowth. Thanakern exhaled sharply. "It's the jungle playing tricks on us. Keep moving." But the further they walked, the louder the voices became. The whispers layered over one another, overlapping, merging into indistinct murmurs, pleading, crying, warning. Then, suddenly, a scream. A gut-wrenching, blood-curdling scream ripped through the jungle, echoing through the trees. It came from ahead, near where the second helicopter was supposed to have crashed. The team broke into a sprint, adrenaline surging through their veins. The mist thickened, and just as Thanakern was about to call for a halt, they stumbled upon the wreckage of the second chopper. Its frame was twisted, blackened by fire, with vines already beginning to reclaim it. The eerie part, there were no bodies, no signs of the crew. Just an empty, shattered machine in the heart of the jungle. Then, from the trees, they saw it. A shadow moved, floated between the trunks, just beyond their vision. Not walking, but gliding. A figure in tattered red garments, its face obscured by darkness. Witcheye raised his rifle, but Thanakern grabbed his wrist. "Don't. Whatever it is, it's watching us." The air turned ice cold. The whispers returned, louder, circling them like a storm. The jungle, once silent, now pulsed with unseen voices. Then, a new sound: rotor blades. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter approached. Relief washed over the team. Reinforcements had arrived. But then Witcheye gasped, "No, that's impossible." Thanakern turned, following his gaze. The helicopter in the sky bore a familiar marking, a call sign they had seen before. It was the first helicopter that had gone down. Their radios crackled to life. A distorted voice cut through the static, barely comprehensible. "You shouldn't have come." The sound of rotors grew deafening. Then, everything went dark. The dense jungle of Kangkratchen National Park loomed over Captain Somchaya and his team as they ventured deeper into the crash sites. The eerie silence was only interrupted by the distant calls of unseen creatures and the occasional rustle of the undergrowth. The weight of the previous days bore heavily on the Group 3 helicopter crash in the same vicinity within a week, each under inexplicable circumstances. The wreckage of the second helicopter, a military transport chopper, lay twisted and charred in a small clearing. Captain Somchaya and Lieutenant Niran exchanged uneasy glances. Unlike the first crash site, where the wreckage was relatively intact, this one seemed almost as if it had been consumed by an unnatural force. The bodies of the soldiers aboard had been recovered earlier, their remains found scattered and eerily undisturbed by scavengers, a chilling contrast to the reality of the jungle. "This place isn't right," Sergeant Girawat muttered, his grip tightening on his rifle. "I've been in plenty of crash, but this feels wrong." Niran nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "It's not just the crash, is it? The way the bodies were found, the fact that the jungle animals won't even come near them. It's as if something else is at play." One of the local rangers, an older man named Uncle Preacha, stepped forward. His face was grim as he surveyed the area. "There is an old legend about this forest," he began, voice hushed. "Long ago, when the Burmese army marched through this land, they were ambushed and massacred here. It is said that their spirits never left. Some call it the curse of the Red Burmese." Somchai scoffed, but not without unease. "You really think an old war curse could bring down 3 helicopters?" Preacha met his gaze steadily. "Call it what you will, Captain. But something unnatural resides here, and it does not take kindly to intruders. The air suddenly shifted. A strong gust of wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. The entire group froze, listening. Then, the sound of movement. Not from an animal, but from something unseen, circling them. Footsteps deliberate, slow. The jungle, which had moments before been brimming with the usual hum of life, had fallen deathly silent. Somchai signaled his men to ready their weapons. The feeling of being watched intensified, prickling at the back of their necks. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a shadow moved, something tall, gaunt, and impossibly fast. A scream rang through the trees. One of the younger soldiers, Private Ek, stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. "I saw it, I saw." His words were cut short as his body was yanked violently into the underbrush. The team rushed after him, flashlights cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing. No footprints, no trace of struggle, just the oppressive silence and the lingering chill of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. The realization sank in. They were not alone. And whatever was here did not want them to leave. The jungle had grown eerily silent. The deeper they ventured, the heavier the air became, as if unseen eyes were watching their every move. Captain Anand, his grip tight on his rifle, led the group toward the last known location of the third crash site. The previous night had been filled with whispers carried by the wind voices speaking in a language none of them understood. They finally reached the remnants of the third helicopter. Unlike the previous wrecks, this one was nearly untouched by fire, its structure eerily intact despite the crash. The vegetation around it was strangely wilted, as if drained of life. A deep sense of unease settled over the group. Somchai, the youngest soldier, knelt beside the wreckage. "So this doesn't make sense. Where are the bodies? The pilot, the crew, they should be here." Captain Anand exchanged glances with Dr. Chaya, the historian who had joined them to document their findings. Chaya's face had turned pale. "This is not natural." The Burmese red curse, it's as if the jungle itself swallowed them. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. As they prepared to leave, a low murmur rose from the surrounding jungle. The same ghostly whispers they had heard the night before now grew louder, forming coherent words in Old Burmese. Chaya's breath hitched as he recognized the phrase, "Leave this place or suffer our fate." Suddenly, the jungle erupted with movement. The sound of unseen footsteps rustled the leaves. Branches swayed violently as if something invisible was rushing past them. Somchai screamed, his eyes wide with terror as he pointed at the wreckage. The cockpit glass, previously intact, now bore the imprint of a human hand pressed against the inside, fingers outstretched. "We need to go, now," Captain Anand shouted, pulling the group away. They ran, the whispers turning into agonized screams behind them. The jungle blurred as they pushed forward, the air growing colder with each step. It wasn't until they reached the clearing near their base camp that the voices ceased, leaving only the sound of their ragged breaths. Dr. Chaya collapsed onto his knees. The curse, it wasn't just a myth. That night, no one slept. The howls of the wind carried something sinister, something ancient. At dawn, they packed up and left, vowing never to return. Months later, the military sealed off the crash sites. No official reports were ever released, and those who had been there refused to speak of it again. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, the wind still carries the whispers of the lost, reminding those who dare listen that some places were never meant to be disturbed. The morning after the eerie voices and inexplicable occurrences, the team decided to push forward deeper into the jungle, determined to uncover the truth behind the helicopter crash. The air was heavy with humidity, and the thick canopy of trees blocked out much of the sunlight, casting long, ominous shadows across the forest floor. As they trudged along the narrow, overgrown path, Nina noticed something peculiar. The footprints they had left behind the previous day had vanished. Not a single mark remained, as if the jungle itself had erased their presence. "Guys, this isn't normal," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark pulled out his GPS, but the screen flickered erratically, refusing to lock onto their location. "We should be right on track, but it's like the system is confused." His brows furrowed as he tapped the device, but it only responded with static interference. Suddenly, a distant rustling echoed from the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of whispering. The voices were indistinct yet undeniably human. They came from multiple directions, encircling them, speaking in an unfamiliar language. A chill ran down Nina's spine as she exchanged wary glances with the others. "We need to keep moving," Ken urged, gripping his flashlight tightly, his knuckles turning white. They quickened their pace, but the deeper they ventured, the more the landscape began to shift. The path they had been following warped and twisted unnaturally, leading them in circles. Trees that should have been familiar now loomed like strangers, their trunks marked with unrecognizable symbols. Then, as abruptly as the whispers had begun, they stopped. The jungle fell into an unnatural silence. Even the chirping of insects and distant calls of wildlife had ceased. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. A sickly sweet scent filled the air, incense, mixed with the faintest trace of something rotten. As Nina turned, her heart nearly stopped. Just a few meters away, through the dense foliage, stood a figure. Clad in tattered military fatigues, its face was obscured by a shadowed helmet, and it stood unnaturally still, as though waiting. Ken's voice trembled. "Is that one of the missing pilots?" Before anyone could react, the figure vanished into the trees as swiftly as it had appeared, leaving behind only a whisper carried by the wind. "Leave now or join us." A sudden gust extinguished their torches, plunging them into darkness. The morning after their harrowing night in the jungle, the group was shaken but determined to leave the cursed area. The echoes of unseen whispers and the feeling of being watched had drained them. With the first light of dawn, they quickly packed up and began their descent from the mountain. As they walked, Thomas glanced at his GPS. "Something's wrong. The route is different from yesterday," he muttered. The marked trail on the map had seemingly shifted. No matter how many times he recalibrated, it still led them deeper into the jungle. "This doesn't make sense. We should be close to the main path by now," May whispered, her voice shaking. "Maybe we took a wrong turn," James suggested, but even he didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, the radio they had borrowed from the ranger station crackled to life. A static-filled voice muttered something unintelligible. Then, the words became clear. "Leave now before it's too late." The voice was deep and distorted, but the message sent chills down their spines. Then, the radio fell silent. "Who was that?" Ben asked, gripping his backpack straps tightly. "Did the Rangers get our distress call?" May's face was pale. "No, that wasn't a ranger." That voice, it sounded. Before she could finish, the wind picked up violently, howling through the trees. The jungle seemed to be whispering, a sinister chant carried on the wind. Then, from behind them, they heard the unmistakable sound of rotor blades, but it was different. It wasn't the rhythmic chopping of a helicopter in flight. It was erratic, distorted, like a ghostly echo from the past. They turned slowly. Through the morning mist, a shadowy figure stood among the trees. It was barely visible, but they could see it wearing a flight suit, one that looked old, tattered, and burnt. The helmet was cracked, revealing a glimpse of charred flesh beneath. The figure raised its hand and pointed directly at them. Thomas felt his breath hitch. The temperature plummeted. The whispers grew louder, and suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. "Run!" James shouted. The group sprinted through the jungle, branches slashing at their arms and legs. The sound of rotor blades and agonized screams filled the air, chasing them as if the spirits of the fallen pilots were closing in. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. They burst through the trees and onto a familiar dirt road. The forest behind them was silent, eerily so. It was as if nothing had ever happened. Gasping for air, May turned to Thomas. "Did you see that? Tell me I wasn't imagining it." Thomas didn't answer. He only held up his GPS. The screen was now displaying the correct route, as if guiding them to safety. Without another word, they hurried back to the ranger station. A few days later, Thomas did some research on the 3 helicopter crash at King Cratchit. He found an old interview from a surviving soldier, one of the few who should have been on the 3rd helicopter but had been left behind. In the interview, the man recounted how he had heard voices calling his name in the jungle before the flight. He had felt an overwhelming sense of dread and refused to board the helicopter. "It was like something was warning me," the soldier had said. Or maybe something was choosing who would survive. Thomas closed his laptop, his hands shaking. The group never spoke of the incident again. But sometimes, When Thomas was alone in a quiet room, he swore he could still hear the faint sound of a helicopter's rotor blades in the distance. Screams in the Wind Tunnel. Thailand's mountain ranges are breathtaking, vast stretches of greenery, ancient trails winding through dense forests, and peaks that touch the clouds. But amid this beauty lies a place shrouded in mystery and fear, the Wind Tunnel of Phu Hin Rong Kla. Locals speak in hushed tones about the eerie sounds that echo from the tunnel. They say that on quiet nights, a blood-curdling scream can be heard, carried by the wind as it rushes through the rocky passage. Some claim it's just the wind playing tricks, but others whisper of souls trapped within, forever crying out for release. Curious and undeterred by superstition, a group of friends set out to explore the mountains, unaware of the chilling encounter that awaited them. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun began its descent. Elm, the adventurous leader of the group, sat at the wheel, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Beside her was then the quiet but observant one, clutching his camera, ready to capture every moment. In the back seat, May and King were laughing, their playful banter filling the car with light-hearted energy. "Are you sure about this place?" May asked, her voice tinged with nervousness. "I heard it's haunted." Aum rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on, it's just an old legend. Besides, we've been to scarier places." King smirked, nudging May, afraid of a little wind. May crossed her arms, feigning confidence. "No, just curious, that's all," then spoke up, his tone serious. "The locals call it the Tunnel of Screams. They say the wind howls like a woman's scream. Some believe it's the spirit of a lost traveler or worse." Silence fell over the group, a chill running down their spines. Aum laughed, breaking the tension. Ghost stories, perfect for a camping trip. They continued their journey, the road winding up the mountain, the air growing cooler as they ascended. The landscape was stunning, the valley stretching out below, framed by towering cliffs. But as they neared their destination, a sense of unease settled over them. The trees grew denser, their branches tangled, casting twisted shadows across the path. The wind whistled through the leaves, a haunting melody that seemed to echo around them. They arrived at the campsite just as dusk settled, the golden light fading to deep blue. As they set up their tents, a local villager approached, his face worn by time and worry. "You shouldn't stay here," he warned, his voice low. "The tunnel, it's cursed." Aum raised an eyebrow. "Cursed? You mean the Wind Tunnel?" The man's eyes darkened. "Long ago, a woman lost her way in the mountains. She searched for her husband who never returned from war. She wandered for days, her cries echoing through the valley until she fell from the cliff near the tunnel." He looked toward the jagged rocks in the distance. Her spirit never found peace. On nights when the wind is strong, her screams fill the tunnel, searching for her lost love. Dan's grip on his camera tightened. "Do people still hear it?" The villager's expression was grave. "They do. And those who follow the screams are never seen again." With that, he turned and walked away, his silhouette vanishing into the trees. King scoffed, forcing a laugh. Just another ghost story to scare tourists. But his voice wavered, betraying his unease. Night fell swiftly, the darkness settling heavily over the camp. Stars dotted the sky, but the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. The wind picked up, a cold breeze weaving through the trees. They gathered around the campfire, the flames crackling, casting flickering shadows on their faces. Aum was her usual fearless self, telling jokes and recounting old adventures. But Dan's eyes kept drifting toward the tunnel entrance, barely visible beyond the campsite. May shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. "It's colder than I thought." Aum tossed another log into the fire. "That's just mountain weather for you." But as the wind howled through the valley, a different sound carried with it, a faint, distant scream. It was high-pitched, almost human, echoing off the rocky walls of the tunnel. It grew louder, piercing the night air before fading into silence. The group froze, their faces paling. May's voice trembled. Did you hear that?" King forced a laugh, his bravado cracking. "Just the wind, right?" Dan's eyes remained fixed on the tunnel. It sounded like someone screaming. Aum's expression hardened. "It's just an echo." The rocks must amplify the sound. But even she couldn't hide the chill running down her spine. The wind howled again, the scream riding on its current, haunting and mournful, as if pleading for help. A shiver ran through them, their breath visible in the cold air. The fire flickered, the shadows around them growing darker, deeper. Aum stood up, her voice firm. We're here to explore. And that's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, we'll check out that tunnel. May's eyes widened. You're kidding, right? Aum's gaze was steady, though her voice wavered slightly. We came all this way. We're not leaving because of some spooky noises. Then looked back at the tunnel, his heart pounding. Yeah, we need to see what's really in there. The decision was made, but as they settled into their tents, the wind continued to wail, carrying with it the chilling echo of a scream. None of them slept soundly that night, and in the darkness, something watched from the mouth of the tunnel, waiting patiently. The group of friends, Yom, Than, May, and Kang, had set up camp near the eerie wine tunnel of Phu Hin Rong Kla, despite warnings of its haunted past. As night fell, they heard a chilling scream echo from the tunnel, sounding disturbingly human. Determined to face their fears, they decided to explore the tunnel the next day, unaware of the darkness awaiting them. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick canopy of trees. A thin mist clung to the ground, swirling around the campsite. The air was crisp, cold enough to leave a sting on their skin. Aum was the first to step out of her tent, stretching and shaking off the uneasy sleep. She looked around, her eyes landing on the tunnel's entrance. In daylight, it seemed less ominous, just a dark gash in the mountainside. Then joined her, camera in hand. You still want to go in there? Aum shot him a determined look. We didn't come all this way to chicken out. May emerged, rubbing her arms for warmth. That scream, it was real, wasn't it? Kang laughed, though it sounded forced. Probably just the wine. These mountains are full of echoes. Then glanced at his camera, his fingers brushing the cold metal. Echoes don't sound like someone crying for help. They fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Aum broke the tension, her voice firm. We'll go in, take a look, and prove it's just a cave. No ghosts, no curses, just rocks and wine. May hesitated but eventually nodded. Fine, but let's stick together. They packed their gear and headed towards the tunnel. The closer they got, the colder the air became. It was unnatural, a biting chill that didn't match the sunny morning. The tunnel's entrance was massive, framed by jagged rocks, its darkness swallowing the light. Vines clung to the stone, their twisted shapes resembling skeletal fingers reaching outward. May shivered. It's freezing here, like walking into a freezer. Aum turned on her flashlight, the beam piercing the darkness. Let's keep moving. As they entered, the air grew even colder. Their breaths turned to mist, hanging in the air before fading away. The tunnel walls were rough, carved by time and nature, but they seemed to close in on them, narrowing with each step. The sound of their footsteps echoed, bouncing off the walls. But beneath the rhythm of their steps, another sound lingered, a faint whisper, just beyond hearing. Then stopped, his eyes wide. Did you hear that? Kang rolled his eyes. You're just spooking yourself. But then wasn't convinced. The whisper had sounded like his name, carried on the cold air. Aum moved forward, leading the way. Stay close. We'll go a little deeper, then head back. The tunnel seemed endless, the darkness pressing in around them. Their flashlights barely cut through the blackness, the beam swallowed by the shadows. May's hand trembled as she held her flashlight. It feels like we're being watched. Kang laughed, but his voice shook. By who? Bats? The whisper returned, clearer this time. It echoed softly, curling around them like smoke. Aum. The voice was distant, hollow, yet unmistakable. It was calling Aum's name. She froze, her face paling. Who said that? May's eyes were wide with fear. No one, we're the only ones here. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Aum, come here. The voice was melodic, almost hypnotic, carrying a sorrowful plea. It echoed off the stone walls, swirling around them. Aum took a step forward, her movements rigid, her eyes unfocused. I need to go. Then grabbed her arm, shaking her. Aum, snap out of it. She blinked, her head shaking as if waking from a dream. What just happened? Kang's face was pale. We need to get out of here, now. They turned back, rushing towards the tunnel's exit. But the shadows seemed to stretch, the path winding longer than they remembered. The walls were closing in, the air growing colder. The whisper followed them, growing louder, more desperate. Don't leave, stay with me. It was pleading, a mournful wail that echoed endlessly. The sound grew distorted, twisting into an agonized scream. May covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. "Make it stop, please," then pushed her forward. "Keep moving, don't listen to it." They stumbled out of the tunnel, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. The sunlight was blinding, the warmth shocking against their frozen skin. The scream echoed one last time, a heart-wrenching cry that faded into the wind. They looked back at the tunnel's entrance. It stood silent, unmoving, an empty maw of darkness. Aom's voice was a whisper. It knew my name. Kang shook his head, his face pale. "This place is cursed. We're leaving, tonight." Then stared at the tunnel, his camera still recording. What was that? No one had an answer, but as they turned to leave, none of them noticed the faint figure standing in the tunnel's shadow. A woman's silhouette, her face obscured, her mouth open in a silent scream. She watched them, her eyes hollow, her form flickering before fading into the darkness. The wind howled, echoing through the valley. And within that howl, the faint whisper returned, barely audible. "Don't leave me." After hearing an eerie scream from the wine tunnel of Fuhin Rong Kla, then May, and King ventured inside, determined to find the source. But the darkness was alive, whispering their names, calling them deeper. Aom was momentarily entranced by the voice, and they barely escaped the tunnel's grasp. But as they fled, none noticed the spectral figure watching them from the shadows. They vowed to leave the haunted place that night, but the curse was far from finished with them. The afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows as the group frantically packed their campsite. The cheerful atmosphere of the previous day was gone, replaced by a tense urgency. The air was heavy, each gust of wind carrying a faint echo of the scream they'd heard inside the tunnel. King's hands were trembling as he rolled up his sleeping bag. "I told you this was a bad idea. I told you." May's eyes were red, her face pale. "That voice, it knew your name, Aom. How is that possible?" Aom's hands froze mid-pack. Her mind replayed the soft, mournful whisper, the way it wrapped around her, almost lovingly. "I don't know, but we're leaving, now." Dan was checking his camera, his face pale. I caught some of it, the whispers. But the audio was distorted. He played the recording, and their blood ran cold. From the speaker, a faint, sorrowful voice echoed. "Aom, don't leave, stay with me." The voice was unmistakable, yet layered beneath it was something darker, a growl that seemed to vibrate through the air. Aom slapped the camera shut. "Turn it off. I don't want to hear it again." They set off down the mountain trail, moving quickly, almost running. The dense jungle closed around them, the trees swaying ominously as the wind howled. It felt like the forest was watching, each rustling leaf whispering in a language they couldn't understand. Dan led the way, his eyes fixed on his GPS. "The exit's just ahead. We'll be out of here soon," but the path was unfamiliar. The trees seemed to shift, twisting into unfamiliar shapes, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. May stumbled, panic in her voice. This isn't the way we came." "Where are we?" Kang's voice shook. "We're lost. How are we lost? It's the same trail." Then tapped his GPS, confusion spreading across his face. "It's not working. The map's all wrong. The path is gone." Aeon looked around, her heart pounding. The forest was dense, impenetrable, the shadows stretching longer, darker. "It's like it's changing around us." A cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a familiar voice. "Aeon, come back, stay with me." They spun around, flashlights sweeping through the dense foliage. But the jungle was empty, silent. King's face was white with fear. "It's following us, that thing, it's here." Aeon's eyes widened as a memory surfaced. The old man at the village, his warning. Those who hear her voice never return. She was left behind, her spirit wandering, waiting for someone to take her place. Her voice trembled. The legend, she's looking for someone to replace her. Dan's eyes darkened. "You mean it wants you?" Aeon shook her head, her fear turning to determination. "No, it wants anyone. It's lonely and it's trying to trap us here just like her." May's hand shook as she gripped Aeon's arm. "Then we need to keep moving. We can't stay here." A distant scream pierced the air, echoing through the trees. It was the same agonized wail they'd heard from the tunnel, but this time it was closer. Too close. Dan's voice was hoarse. "Run, now." They ran through the dense jungle, branches scratching their faces, roots grabbing at their feet. The forest twisted around them, paths looping back on themselves, trees bending to block their escape. The scream followed them, distorted, echoing from every direction. It was everywhere, surrounding them, the voice breaking into sobs, cries of pain and despair. Don't leave me." Aom's vision blurred as terror stung her eyes. I'm not the one who left you." The scream grew louder, the shadows twisting into shapes, long, slender figures with hollow eyes, reaching out with skeletal hands. May stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell, her scream cutting through the air. "Help, it's got me." Kang'an then turned back, grabbing her arms, pulling her up. But her leg was bleeding, 3 long scratches running down her calf. Dan's voice shook. What did that?" Aom looked around, the shadows dancing, faces forming in the mist, mouths open in silent screams. "We're not alone, we need to keep moving." The trees closed in, the forest bending, twisting, leading them back to the entrance of the wind tunnel. The black maw loomed before them, the air freezing cold. The scream echoed from within, a sorrowful wail that beckoned them closer. Aom's knees buckled. "No, we left." May collapsed, clutching her leg, her face pale. "We can't, it won't let us go." King fell to his knees, his voice breaking. We're trapped just like her." The scream echoed again, a whisper curling through the air, cold fingers brushing their skin. "Stay with me forever." Aom's eyes were wide with terror. The tunnel was calling her, the voice inside so familiar, so lonely. It tugged at her heart, drawing her closer. Then grabbed her shoulder. "Well, don't listen, fight it." But she was slipping, her body moving on its own, her feet dragging her towards the darkness. "I can't, it's too strong." The shadows reached out, long arms wrapping around her, pulling her in. The others tried to hold her back, but the force was relentless, tearing her from their grasp. Aom's scream was swallowed by the darkness, her figure disappearing into the tunnel's mouth. Then, May and Kang stood frozen, their faces pale, eyes wide with horror. Then the voice returned, whispering through the trees. "Aom is with me forever." The tunnel fell silent, the air growing still. But in the distance, another scream echoed. It was familiar, sounding just like Aom. The forest watched, its shadows shifting. And the wind tunnel waited, hungry for more. Aom was pulled into the darkness of the wind tunnel, her scream swallowed by the shadows. Then, May and Ken were left standing at the entrance, the echoes of her voice still ringing in their ears. But the tunnel wasn't done with them yet. The ancient curse of the Fuhin Rong Claw Mountains was far from over, and the shadows were still hungry. The air was thick with dread. The jungle was silent, unnaturally so, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The entrance to the wind tunnel stood before them, a yawning black maw that seemed to absorb all light. The air was cold, the temperature dropping with every step closer. May's knees buckled as she stared into the darkness. "She's gone, Aom is gone." King shook his head, his face pale. We have to get her back. We can't leave her here." Dan's hands were trembling, but his jaw was set. "We go in, we end this ... together." May looked up, fear in her eyes. "But what if we don't come back?" Dan's eyes were cold. "Then we stay just like her." The three stood before the tunnel, the shadows shifting within. The wind whispered, carrying a voice that was no longer human. "Aom, stay forever." Without another word, they stepped into the darkness. The air inside was freezing, every breath a cloud of mist. The walls were damp, covered in moss that seemed to pulse beneath their fingers. Their flashlights flickered, the beams struggling to penetrate the inky blackness. King's voice was hoarse. "This place, it's alive." May's fingers dug into Dan's arm. Do you hear that?" From the darkness, the faint sound of footsteps echoed, slow, deliberate, circling them. Aom's voice called out, distant, echoing off the walls. "Help, please, I'm here." Dan's eyes widened. "Aom, where are you?" But as the words left his mouth, the voice changed, twisting into a distorted mockery of Aom's tone. "Here with me forever." The shadows shifted, forming shapes, faces with hollow eyes and twisted mouths, whispering in languages they couldn't understand. May's hands were shaking. "We need to leave, this isn't right." But the tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, the exit lost behind them. There was no going back. The path twisted, leading them to a cavernous chamber deep within the mountain. In the center, a stone altar stood, covered in vines and ancient carvings. Candles flickered around it, their flames unnaturally still. On the walls, carvings depicted a woman, her face contorted in sorrow, reaching out to figures who turned away, abandoning her. Beneath her, shadows crawled, wrapping around her body, pulling her into darkness. Dan's eyes widened as the legend pieced together. She was left behind, betrayed by those she loved, and her spirit it became this. May's voice trembled. She's trapped here and she wants someone to take her place. The air grew colder, the shadows swirling around them. The candles flickered, their flames dancing as a figure stepped out from the darkness. Aum stood before them, her face pale, eyes vacant. Her mouth moved, but her voice was not her own. It was layered, distorted, echoing with the sorrow of the ancient spirit. Aum is mine now, she stays forever. Then stepped forward, his voice breaking. No, Aum, fight it. You're stronger than this. Aum's body moved jerkily, like a marionette on strings. Her head tilted, eyes empty. She belongs to me just as you will. The shadows erupted from the walls, tendrils of darkness lunging at them. May screamed as the shadows wrapped around her, pulling her towards the altar. Kang grabbed her arm, fighting against the pull. No, let her go, then ran to Aum, shaking her. Aum, wake up, fight it. For a moment, her eyes flickered, her lips trembling. Then help me. But the spirit's voice took over, a guttural growl. She is mine. The shadows surged, knocking them to the ground. Kang and May struggled, their bodies being pulled towards the altar. Dan's vision blurred, the darkness consuming everything. He heard the spirit's voice, whispering, calling his name. Then stay with me forever. Dan's eyes snapped open. He remembered the carvings. The woman was trapped because she was abandoned, left alone. She needed someone to replace her. His voice was firm. You were left behind, betrayed. But I won't leave you, I'll stay, take me instead. The shadows paused, the air growing still. Aum's body froze, the spirit's face contorting in shock. You would stay for her. Then nodded, tears in his eyes. Yes, I won't leave her, not like they left you. The spirit's face softened, her hollow eyes glistening. Alone for so long, so cold. The shadows hesitated, their grip loosening on Kang and May. The candles flickered, the air warming. The spirit's voice wavered, a whisper of sorrow. Then you will stay and she will go. Aum collapsed, her body limp. May and Kang pulled her away, holding her tight. Then looked back, his eyes meeting the spirit's. Her face was no longer twisted in anger. She looked human. She reached out, her fingers brushing his cheek. Thank you for not leaving me alone. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him towards the altar. His body grew cold, his vision fading. But he smiled, his last words a whisper. Take care of her for me. Aum woke up, her head throbbing. May's tear-streaked face was the first thing she saw. Aum, you're back. Kang's voice was hoarse. We thought we lost you. Aum's eyes widened. Then where's then? May's face fell, tears streaming down. He stayed for you, for us. Aum's heart shattered. She looked at the tunnel, now silent, the darkness no longer moving. But as the wind blew, she heard his voice, soft and gentle. Take care, Aum. She broke down, her cries echoing through the jungle. The wind tunnel stood still, its curse finally broken. But in the shadows, a figure stood, watching. A man, his face soft, his eyes warm. Dan's spirit lingered, guarding the place he had chosen to stay, forever. The mysterious shadow at Phu Duing, one of Thailand's most famous mountain destinations, is known for its breathtaking views, cool climate, and serene atmosphere. But beneath the beauty lies a history of sorrow and legends that whisper through the cold mountain air. It was said that those who lost their way on the mountain never truly left. Their shadows remained, wandering the cliffs and pine forests, searching for a way back. Locals warned travelers to stay close to their campsites at night and never to follow shadows that did not belong to them. But legends are just stories, or are they? For friends, eager for adventure and a break from the chaos of city life, decided to camp on the summit of Phu Duing. There was then the charismatic leader, May, the cheerful optimist, Ken, the skeptical realist, and Mint, the quiet observer who always carried her camera. They arrived at the base of the mountain early in the morning, the air crisp with a faint scent of pine. After registering at the visitor center, they began their ascent. The trail was steep, winding through lush forests and rocky paths. Vendors at rest points cheered them on, selling drinks and snacks to weary hikers. Kang grumbled as they continued up the steep trail. Who thought this was a good idea again? Then laughed, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Come on, man. This is an adventure. Think of the view at the top. Mint smiled, snapping pictures of the surrounding forest. It's beautiful, and totally worth the climb. May beamed, her energy unwavering. We'll make memories we'll never forget. They finally reached the summit by afternoon. The view was breathtaking, an endless stretch of green forests, rolling hills, and a sky painted with hues of orange and pink. They set up camp near the cliff's edge, a spot recommended for the best sunrise view. As the sun began to set, a cold breeze swept through the campsite. The temperature dropped rapidly, and the mountain seemed to come alive, the rustling of leaves echoing around them. Then looked around, his smile fading slightly. It feels different up here. Quiet. Kang shrugged. We're on a mountain. It's supposed to be quiet. May shivered, wrapping her jacket tighter. Yeah, but it's like the quiet is listening. Mint's camera clicked, capturing the last light of day. Let's get a fire going. It'll keep us warm and maybe break this eerie silence. They gathered around the campfire as darkness fell, the flames flickering and casting shadows around them. Shadows that seemed to move just a bit too much. As they huddled around the fire, then shared the story he had heard from a local guide earlier that day. They say Phu Doing is haunted, then began, his voice low and dramatic. Long ago, a group of travelers got lost on this mountain. They were never found. It's said their shadows still wander here, trying to find their way back or maybe trying to find someone to take their place. May's eyes widened. That's creepy, Kang rolled his eyes. Just a story to scare tourists, then grinned. Maybe, but they say if you see a shadow moving around your tent at night, don't follow it. It might not be yours. Mint shuddered, glancing around at the darkness beyond the firelight. I think we should go to bed early tonight. They laughed, brushing off the unease the story brought. But as they retreated to their tents, the wind howled through the trees, sounding almost like whispers. The night was colder than expected. The wind howled, rustling the leaves and shaking the tents. May tossed and turned, unable to sleep. She could hear the faint rustling of leaves, the distant sound of branches creaking. Then, she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the tents. Crunching against the dried leaves and twigs on the forest floor. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps were steady and hurried, as if someone was walking around the campsite watching. She peeked through the small gap in her tent zipper. Her breath caught in her throat. A shadow moved, just outside the circle of firelight. A figure, tall and thin, walking slowly around the tents. It moved fluidly, almost gliding across the ground. May's voice trembled as she whispered, "Then King Mint, are you guys awake?" No answer. The footsteps continued, circling her tent, then moving to the next. She closed her eyes, her hands shaking, as she hugged her sleeping bag tighter. She didn't dare open the tent. She didn't dare breathe. The footsteps stopped, right outside her tent. The shadow lingered, its shape flickering as if distorted by the firelight. May's heart raced, her body frozen in fear. She could feel it watching her, even though she couldn't see its face. Then, slowly, the shadow moved away, continuing its circle around the campsite. May stayed awake the rest of the night, her eyes wide open, ears straining to hear the footsteps that echoed in her mind long after they were gone. The first night at Phu Doing was far from peaceful. As the cold mountain wind howled, May heard footsteps circling the tents, accompanied by the haunting presence of a shadow that moved too fluidly to be human. She stayed awake, paralyzed by fear, until dawn broke, but the night was only the beginning. Morning arrived with the sun casting a golden hue over the mountain. The cold was replaced by a gentle warmth, and the air was filled with the scent of dew-covered grass. But for May, the daylight did little to erase the terror of the night before. She emerged from her tent, exhausted and pale. Dan was already up, boiling water for coffee. He flashed a grin. Rough night. May hesitated. Should she tell them? Would they believe her? Before she could answer, King emerged, stretching. I didn't sleep well either. The wind was crazy last night. May's heart skipped a beat. Did you hear anything, like footsteps? Kang raised an eyebrow. Footsteps? You mean like animals, we're in the forest? Could have been anything. Then laughed. Maybe a deer was curious about your snoring. May forced a smile, but her mind replayed the steady, deliberate steps. Yeah, maybe. Mint joined them, camera in hand, snapping pictures of the sunrise. The view is amazing. Totally worth the climb. She noticed May's tired eyes. You okay? May nodded, her smile wavering. Just didn't sleep well. She glanced at the ground around the tents, expecting to see footprints in the dirt, but there were none. Not a single mark. Her stomach turned. Whatever walked around the tents last night didn't leave any trace. As they sat down for breakfast, then continued his storytelling. I asked the park ranger about the legend I told you guys last night. Kang rolled his eyes. Here we go again. Then ignored him. The ranger said there are stories about shadows that wander Fucraw doing. They belong to people who got lost on the mountain, people who never made it back down. May's hands went cold. What do you mean? Dan's eyes gleamed with excitement. They say the shadows don't know they're dead. They keep walking, searching for a way home. But here's the creepy part: if they find someone whose shadow they like, they'll take it, leaving the person to wander in their place. Mint shivered. That's just a story, right? Then grinned. Of course. But the ranger did say one more thing: if you see a shadow moving that doesn't belong to anyone, don't follow it. No matter how curious you are. May's heart raced. The shadow she saw last night, it moved on its own, circling the tents. Was it looking for a shadow to take? She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just my imagination, just the wind, she whispered to herself. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Determined not to let her fear ruin the trip, May joined the others for a hike to Whanokline, the famous viewpoint known for its breathtaking cliffs and panoramic views. The trail was beautiful, lined with pine trees and blooming wildflowers. They laughed, took photos, and marveled at the stunning scenery. For a moment, May almost forgot about the shadow. Almost. As they reached the viewpoint, they stood in awe of the endless horizon. The wind was strong, howling as it rushed over the cliffs. Mint began snapping pictures, her eyes focused on capturing the perfect shot. This place is magical. Then stood near the edge, his arms outstretched as if to embrace the sky. I feel alive. May's heart lightened, watching her friends enjoy the moment. But then she saw it, a shadow, standing near them, too close to be his. Her blood ran cold. The shadow was tall and thin, its shape distorted, as if stretched by the wind. It stood completely still, watching then. May's mouth went dry, then moved away from the edge. Then laughed. What's wrong? Scared I'll fall. Please just move back, May pleaded, her voice shaking. Then turned to look at her, his expression confused. But then his eyes widened as he noticed her pale face, her gaze fixed on the ground behind him. He turned around. The shadow was gone. His face went white. What did you see? May's voice was barely a whisper. A shadow standing right behind you. Kang joined them, his face skeptical. Enough with the ghost stories, May. You're letting these tales get to you. May's eyes filled with fear. I know what I saw. Mint lowered her camera, her eyes serious. I didn't see anything, but the air feels heavy, like we're being watched. Then stepped away from the edge, his shoulders tense. Maybe we should head back to the campsite. They agreed, the excitement of the hike replaced by an uneasy silence. As they walked back to the campsite, May felt eyes on her, the weight of an unseen presence following them. She glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding. There, among the trees, was the shadow. It moved fluidly, gliding from tree to tree, keeping pace with them. It was watching her. May's chest tightened. She quickened her pace, her eyes fixed on the trail ahead. But no matter how fast she walked, she could feel it. The shadow was right behind her. She wanted to scream, to tell the others, but her voice was trapped, fear choking her words. The legend echoed in her mind. If you see a shadow moving that doesn't belong to anyone, don't follow it. But what if the shadow was following her? They reached the campsite just as the sun began to set. But as darkness fell, May knew the shadows would come again, and this time, they wouldn't just watch. After seeing the shadow behind them at the cliff's edge, May can no longer convince herself it's all in her imagination. The shadows are real, and they are watching her. As the group returns to the campsite, the air grows heavy, and the darkness brings a chilling sense of dread. But the shadows aren't just watching anymore, they're getting closer. Night fell swiftly over Phu Kra Duang, the temperature dropping as the sky turned a deep shade of indigo. The campsite, once alive with laughter and stories, now felt eerily silent. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. May sat close to the fire, its flickering light the only source of warmth and comfort. She watched the shadows dance around them, her mind replaying the events of the day. Mint broke the silence, her voice uneasy. Did anyone else feel weird at the viewpoint, like we weren't alone? Den laughed, but his tone lacked its usual confidence. Don't let May's ghost stories get to you. King poked at the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. It's just our minds playing tricks. We're in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by darkness. It's normal to feel uneasy. May's hands trembled as she held her mug of instant coffee. I saw it again, the shadow. It was behind you. Then, it was watching you. The group fell silent. Then forced a chuckle, but his eyes darted around the campsite. You're just spooked. There's nothing out there. May looked at him, her voice low. Then why are you so scared? Then opened his mouth to protest but said nothing. His eyes betrayed his fear. Mint shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. I don't like this place. It feels wrong. King shook his head. We're overthinking it. Let's just get some sleep and leave early tomorrow. They agreed, each trying to convince themselves that it was just their imagination. But as they crawled into their tents, the unease lingered. As May zipped up her tent, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her mind wandered to Dan's story about the shadow's lost souls searching for a way home. But there was more to the legend, something the ranger had only whispered. They say the shadows can't leave the mountain, then had told them. Trapped by a curse, they wander the forest, longing to escape. And if they find someone whose shadow they like, they take it, leaving the person to wander in their place. May shuddered. Why do they take shadows? She had asked. Dan's face grew serious. Because without a shadow, they can't leave. They needed to pass into the world of the living to be free. May's heart raced. The shadow she saw was it looking for her shadow. A sudden rustling outside her tent made her freeze. She held her breath, straining to listen. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the tents. May's blood ran cold. The same footsteps she heard the first night. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to convince herself it was just an animal. But the footsteps were too steady, too purposeful. They stopped right outside her tent. She covered her mouth, stifling a scream. The air grew cold, and she could feel its presence waiting, watching. Then the whispering began, a faint, chilling voice, so soft she could barely make out the words. It sounded like her name, May. Her heart pounded, her body paralyzed with fear. The voice was wrong, distorted, like an echo from somewhere far away. It called her name again, pleading, desperate. May, help me. She knew she shouldn't listen, shouldn't respond. But the voice was so sorrowful, so human. Her trembling hand reached for the zipper, but she stopped herself just in time. The legend echoed in her mind. If you see a shadow moving that doesn't belong to anyone, don't follow it. But it wasn't just the shadow she had to fear. It was its voice, its call. She stayed frozen, tears streaming down her face, praying for the dawn to come. Just as she thought she couldn't take it any longer, the whispering stopped. Silence. May's body relaxed, her muscles aching from the tension. Maybe it was over. Maybe it was just a dream. But then she heard it. The zipper of her tent slowly opening. Her heart stopped. She had locked it from the inside. How was it opening? The cold air rushed in, and the darkness outside seemed to move, twisting and swirling like smoke. A shadow slid into her tent, its shape shifting, unnatural. It had no face, no eyes, but she could feel it looking at her. May tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow reached out, its hands stretching impossibly long, fingers curling like smoke. It touched her face, cold as death. Her body went numb, her vision blurring. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own shadow detaching from her body. The shadow took it, wrapping it around itself like a cloak. It stood up, her silhouette perfectly mimicked, and walked out of the tent, leaving her behind, empty and hollow. The sun rose over Phu Kra Duang, bathing the campsite in golden light. Birds chirped, the forest waking to a new day. Mint was the first to notice. May's still asleep. Kang knocked on her tent. May, wake up, lazy. No answer, then unzipped the tent, laughing. She probably stayed up all night again, paranoid from my stories. But his laughter died as he looked inside. May was lying there, her eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Her face was pale, her body cold. Kang shook her. May, wake up. But she didn't move. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. Mint covered her mouth, tears streaming down her face. No, this can't be. Then stumbled back, his legs shaking. She looks empty, Mint whispered, her voice trembling. Where's her shadow? They looked at the ground, their own shadows stretching in the morning light. But May's body cast no shadow. It was gone. Kang backed away, his face pale. This is wrong, this is all wrong. We need to leave, now. But as they packed up, then froze, his eyes wide with terror. A figure stood at the edge of the campsite. It looked like May, but its face was wrong to smooth, to blank. It watched them, its body perfectly still. Then it turned and walked into the forest, moving unnaturally, its shadow twisting and writhing like smoke. Mint screamed. That's not May. That's her shadow. They ran, leaving the campsite behind. But the forest felt darker, the shadows longer, as if they were being followed. May's lifeless body was found in her tent, her shadow gone, leaving behind an empty shell. Yet, something that looked like her shadow was seen walking into the forest. The legend was true. The shadows of Fukradoing were not just echoes of the past. They were hunters, searching for souls to take. Now, the survivors then, Mint, and Kang must find a way to escape before they to become shadows lost in the mountain's curse. They ran. Branches tore at their skin, roots threatened to trip them, but they didn't dare slow down. The forest around them seemed to twist and change, the path back to civilization vanishing before their eyes. Where is the trail? Mint's voice trembled as she looked around, eyes wide with panic. Kang spun in circles, his breaths rapid. We just came from that direction. How can it be gone? Dan's face was pale, his eyes hollow. It's the shadows, they're playing with us. Mint shook her head, tears streaming down her face. This isn't real, this can't be real. Then grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. Get it together, we need to stay calm and stick together. If we get separated. A cold wind blew through the trees, carrying a whisper. A voice so faint it could have been mistaken for the rustling of leaves. Then, his blood froze. The voice was soft, pleading, familiar. It was May's voice. He whipped around, eyes scanning the forest. Nay, Mint grabbed his arm. No. It's not her. The whisper grew louder, closer. Then help me, I'm lost. Dan's face twisted in anguish. No, she's gone. But his feet started to move, his body pulled towards the voice, his heart screaming to save his friend. Kang and Mint held him back, digging their heels into the dirt. It's not her, Kang shouted. It's the shadow, it's trying to take you too. Then fought against them, tears streaming down his face. May, I promised to protect you. Mint slapped him hard. Snap out of it, if you go you won't come back. Dan's body went limp, his face crumbling in despair. She sounds so scared. Mint's voice broke. I know, but that's not her anymore. The whisper turned cold, its tone shifting to something dark, mocking. Then don't you want to save me? Kang's face went pale. We have to go now. They stumbled away, fighting every instinct that screamed at them to look back. But they knew that if they did they would see her. May's shadow, standing just beyond the trees, watching them with hollow eyes. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch towards them, hungry and alive. The campsite was far behind them, but they were no closer to escaping the mountain. Every path they took circled back to the same spot, a clearing with a twisted, ancient tree at its center. Kang fell to his knees, panting. We're trapped. Dan's eyes were wide with terror. We've passed this tree 3 times. It's like the forest won't let us leave. Mint looked around, her body shaking. The shadows they're closing in. Dark shapes moved between the trees, blending into the twilight. They were everywhere, circling, waiting. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and with it came the whispers. Mint, Kang, Dan. The shadows called to them, voices that were painfully familiar, friends, family. May. Kang covered his ears. Stop it, you're not real. The shadows moved closer, their forms shifting, faces appearing, faces they knew. May stood before them, her eyes empty, her voice hollow. Why did you leave me? Mint backed away, shaking her head. No, you're not, May, you're not. The shadow that looked like May smiled, a cruel, twisted smile. You let me die, now I'm alone, come with me so I won't be lonely. Mint screamed, falling to the ground as the shadows swarmed around her. King pulled her up. Run, we have to run. But there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in from all sides, faces shifting, arms reaching. Dan's voice broke. We're not getting out of here. A figure stepped forward, its shape solidifying. It was the ranger they met on the first day, the one who warned them about the shadows. But his eyes were empty, his body half transparent. Dan's jaw dropped. You're one of them. The ranger's face twisted with sorrow. I was once like you, lost in this forest, hunted by the shadows. King's face went pale. What are they? The ranger looked at the ancient tree, his voice hollow. They are the lost souls, victims of the mountain's curse. Trapped here, unable to move on. They take the shadows of the living to escape. But those they take become shadows themselves, cursed to wander this place for eternity. Mint's body trembled. May's one of them now, the ranger nodded. She lost her shadow, now she belongs to the mountain. Dan's eyes filled with tears. There's no way out, is there? The ranger's expression softened. There is one way, but you must leave something behind. King's voice was desperate. What do we have to leave? The ranger's form began to fade, his voice echoing. Your shadows, leave them behind and run before they take you too. Then looked down, realizing his shadow was already fading, the darkness pulling at his feet. Mint screamed, her shadow stretching, twisting towards the ancient tree. No, I don't want to stay here. King's face hardened. We have to go, now. They ran, leaving their shadows behind, the darkness clawing at them, screaming, pleading, begging them to stay. The shadows they left behind took form, their own faces twisted with despair, eyes hollow, trapped forever. They stumbled out of the forest, the sunlight blinding, their bodies cold and exhausted. But something was wrong. Then looked down, his heart stopping. His body stood in the sunlight, but there was no shadow beneath him. Mint gasped, tears streaming down her face. We left them behind. King's voice was hollow. We escaped, but we're not whole anymore. They had survived Fukrah doing, but they would never truly leave. Without their shadows, they were only half alive, cursed to live in the light, but never in the dark. And in the forest, their shadows watched, trapped beneath the ancient tree, waiting for the next group of hikers to take their place.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.